Good morning, everyone. It's so great to see you today. Hope you enjoy this. We will begin with our presentation, and then we will divide up into two different buses. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Alan Pollock. He is an amazing historian of the St. Francis Dam. So, here he is.
I'll take this one. Does this work? Hello. Can you hear me?
No. Oh, there it went. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. We're really excited. This is the first year we have done this tour twice because a number of you were on our waiting list for the first tour, and we were happy to be able to get you on this one. We thank everybody for coming. I want to do, since this is sponsored by the SCV Historical Society, I wanted to just put in one shameless plug. We have been closed at the Historical Society at what was called Heritage Junction, and is now the Santa Clarita History Center for the last 3 years since the pandemic started. But we're hoping to open up again in the next year to 2 years, and the reason it's taken that long is because we are creating 2 new museums, one of which is going to be in our Pardee House, and it's going to be a professional history, museum of local history for Santa Clarita. So we're really looking forward to showing you that. It's going to have rotating exhibits, permanent exhibits. We hope to be a real professional museum. Second, the Saugus train station is now going to be turned into a railroad museum, representing how it looked in the early to mid 20th century. So it should be really nice for railroad buffs out there. Did I miss anything, Lois?
No, good job.
Okay, thank you. Now I'd like to first introduce, we have 4 great people today that are all St. Francis Dam experts. We're going to have 3 speakers. I'll be starting with a general overview of the St. Francis Dam history, including what led up to it and what the aftermath of it. Then we have Ann Stansel. She is a archaeologist with the California State Park System, a former archaeologist with the National Park Service. She did her master's thesis at Cal State Northridge on the memorialization of the victims of the dam disaster, and her talk will be related to that. And our third speaker will be Diane Hellriegel, who will be giving you a very emotional and interesting talk on the victims and survivors of the dam disaster. Lastly, but not leastly, we have one of the world's leading experts on the St. Francis Dam disaster. We're honored to have here Frank Rock, the dam man, who has actually been leading these tours for many years before us. He's going to be leading one of the buses, and we're very, very honored to have him here.
Born on the dam disaster, but not the year of.
Yeah, he was born on March 12th, actually.
22 years after.
Okay, so I guess we'll get started.
I just wanted to mention that we will have a Q&A afterwards, and we need to keep that fairly short because we will have buses waiting for us. But you can continue to ask questions once you get onto your bus, okay? Enjoy.
All right. So, the St. Francis Dam flood is a tragic chapter in the story of the water history of Los Angeles and Southern California. And I like to say it's also the Shakespearean, what I call the Shakespearean rise and fall story of William Mulholland, probably the most important historical figure in Los Angeles history. Take you back to the story's beginning, 1781, September 4th, 44 settlers founded the Pueblo of Los Angeles, and in the early days of the Pueblo, the city water supply was obtained from the Los Angeles River. Water was brought to the Pueblo through a series of ditches or zanjas. Or I guess if I did my Spanish better, it would be zanjas, right? Not Z. By 1868, the Pueblo population had grown to around 5,000 people. And that year, Los Angeles entered into a 30-year lease contract with a private Los Angeles City Water Company to provide water to the city. In 1875, Fred Eaton became the Los Angeles City Water Company superintendent at the tender age of 19. Eaton, who was a future mayor of Los Angeles, would later play a prominent role in bringing more water to this growing city. In In 1877, Irish immigrant William Mulholland arrived in Los Angeles. The following year, Mulholland was hired by the Los Angeles City Water Company as a zanjero or ditch tender. He was basically a ditch digger. He had no formal schooling, but he was a brilliant man. He read voraciously and taught himself the sciences such as engineering and geology. Mulholland struck up a close friendship with Eaton. He worked his way up through the ranks of the water company, and by 1886 he became superintendent of the water company at the old age of 31. So the population of Los Angeles boomed in the 1880s, primarily due to the coming of the Southern Pacific and Santa Fe railroads, and a tourist explosion inspired by Helen Hunt Jackson's enormously popular book, Ramona. And by the turn of the 20th century, Los Angeles had mushroomed into a population of around 100,000 people, and it became evident to those providing the LA water supply that the Los Angeles River would not be able to supply adequate water if the city were to grow even larger. So Fred Eaton traveled to the Owens Valley in the summer of 1892. He was aware of the impending water crisis in Los Angeles, and when he saw the Owens River for the first time, he began to visualize a possible solution to LA's water problems. After prolonged negotiations starting in 1898, when the lease for the Los Angeles City Water Company ran out, Los Angeles formally took ownership of the first Los Angeles Municipal Waterworks system in 1902. Mulholland continued as superintendent of the new city-owned water company, which was renamed the Bureau of Waterworks and Supply in 1911. In 1904, Eaton took Mulholland on a buckboard trip to the Owens Valley. Eaton wanted to convince Mulholland that the Owens River could be diverted to Los Angeles to become the additional water source the growing city desperately needed. On this trip, Mulholland and Eaton hatched the idea of building an aqueduct from the Owens Valley to the San Fernando Valley. But this proposed project could not occur without the water rights to the Owens River. The National Reclamation Act of June 17, 1902 created the U.S. Reclamation Service. Its primary goal was to create irrigation for the arid regions of the western U.S. Joseph Barlow Lippincott, pictured here, was appointed supervising engineer for California for the Reclamation Service. Late in 1904, Lippincott learned that his friends, Eaton and Mulholland, were considering the Owens River as a water source for Los Angeles. And while still employed by the Reclamation Service, Lippincott helped the city of Los Angeles clandestinely purchase land along the river in the Owens Valley. In March 1905, Eaton traveled to the Owens Valley to buy land options and water rights from Owens Valley ranchers and farmers for Los Angeles. And due to his association with Lippincott, Owens Valley residents assumed that Eaton was purchasing the land for the Reclamation Service. And Eaton never confirmed nor denied this assumption. And this would anger Owens Valley residents for decades to come, even to this day. That same month, Mulholland recommended the Owens River to the Board of Water Commissioners as the only viable water source for Los Angeles. Additionally, Fred Eaton proposed that the city acquire the water rights he had purchased in the Owens Valley from him. On July 29, 1905, Mulholland returned from a car trip to the Owens Valley proclaiming, "The last spike is driven, the options are secure." And here you see a headline in the Los Angeles Times which stated, "Titanic project to give city a river." Later that year, Los Angeles voters approved a $1.5 million bond issue by more than a 10-to-1 margin to purchase Owens Valley land and water rights. And in 1907, Los Angeles voters again gave their overwhelming consent to the project, approving a $23 million bond issue for constructing the aqueduct. Between 1908 and 1913, Mulholland directed the construction of the 233-mile-long Los Angeles aqueduct from the Owens Valley to the San Fernando Valley. The project was completed miraculously on time and within budget, and Mulholland becomes an absolute hero to the city of Los Angeles. And on November 5th, 1913, 40,000 Angelinos arrived by car, wagon, and buggy to celebrate the opening of the Los Angeles aqueduct at the Cascades in present-day Sylmore. That's that little water cascade that you pass on Interstate 5 as you come up to the valley here. So, Mulholland becomes this absolute great hero to Los Angeles, but that was not how the people of the Owens Valley viewed him. In 1921, California encountered drought conditions, with both Los Angeles and the Owens Valley facing water shortages by the spring of 1923. The city began pumping groundwater into Owens Valley to increase its water supply, and Mulholland purchased more properties around Independence, Bishop, and Big Pine, which alarmed their residents. What became known as the Owens Valley Water Wars, or the California Water Wars, began in 1924. Wilfred and Mark Watterson, owners of the Inyo County Bank, formed an irrigation district in 1922 to resist Los Angeles' increased use of Owens Valley water. In response, Los Angeles began randomly purchasing land and water in the Bishop area. And in August 1923, Los Angeles filed a lawsuit against local farmers to prevent them from illegally diverting water. And this was the last straw for the locals. The first violence erupted in May 1924 when 40 men dynamited the Lone Pine Aqueduct spillway gate. In November 1924, Mark Watterson led up to 100 men to occupy the Alabama gates in the Owens Valley, blocking the aqueduct by opening the emergency spillway and causing water to flow into the surrounding area. And by 1927, there had been 10 instances of dynamiting of the aqueduct. But just as the controversy was reaching its zenith, Valley resistance was suddenly undermined when the Wattersons surprisingly closed the doors of all branches of the Inyo County Bank. And it turns out that not only were the Wattersons bankrupt, but they were also tried and convicted of 36 counts of embezzlement against their neighbors, and thus ended the water wars. Between 1924 and 1926, amid concerns about the water wars and potential earthquakes on the San Andreas Fault cutting off the aqueduct, Mulholland built a series of reservoirs around Los Angeles to provide a reserve of water for the city. This particular one is the Hollywood or Mulholland Dam overlooking Hollywood, which is very similarly designed to our dam we're discussing today, and still is out there in Hollywood. The last of these reservoirs was the St. Francis Dam. Construction of the St. Francis Dam began in August 1924 in San Francisquito Canyon. It was originally planned to be 185 feet high, but to increase the reservoir's capacity, Mulholland decided to raise the dam twice by 10 feet to a total of 205 feet without increasing the diameter of the foundation of the dam. This was a significant error in dam building, one of a few that occurred. The dam was unwittingly built against an ancient Paleolithic landslide composed of Polona schist on its eastern abutment. You can see that to the right of this picture. On the western abutment, the left side of this picture, the abutment was a rock called Sespe conglomerate, which tended to dissolve when saturated with water. That was not a good thing. There were several errors made in the construction of the foundation of the dam. The dam was at risk of a phenomenon called hydraulic uplift, or tilting upward from water pressure, due to a lack of drainage wells along the entire foundation, except at the center section, which was the only part that survived the disaster. Although it was probably not a major factor in the dam failure, it was noted that the concrete mixture was also of questionable quality, as local rock was added to the concrete mix and was not adequately washed. Construction of the St. Francis Dam was completed in 1926, and water began to fill the reservoir on March 1st, 1926. It took 2 years to fill the reservoir, and on March 7th, 1928, the water reached its highest level within 3 inches below the crest of the spillway. Just 5 days later, tragedy struck the St. Francis Dam and began William Mulholland's worst nightmare. Now we take you to March 12, 1928, 10:30 a.m., and dam keeper Tony Harnischfager discovered a new leak in the dam's western abutment. He was especially concerned with the muddy content of the runoff he observed, which might indicate the water was eroding the dam's foundation. And he immediately alerted Mulholland. Mulholland and his assistant Harvey Van Norman arrived and began inspecting the area of the leak. Van Norman discovered that the water's muddy appearance was coming not from the dam leak, but from a place where it came into contact with loose soil from a newly cut access road. And for the next 2 hours, Mulholland, Van Norman, and Harnischweger inspected the dam, finding nothing unusual or concerning for a large dam. Mulholland and Van Norman were convinced that the new leak posed no threat, so they returned to Los Angeles, a decision Mulholland would regret for the rest of his life. That same evening at 11:50 p.m., Ace Hopewell, a carpenter at Powerhouse Number 1, rode past the dam on his motorcycle. Approximately 1 mile upstream from the dam, he heard a noise that he later described as rocks rolling down the mountain. He stopped, dismounted from his motorcycle, smoked a cigarette while checking the hillside above him, and he could still hear the sound that caught his attention earlier. Assuming it was a landslide, since they were common to the area, and satisfied he was in no danger, he continued on his way. Turns out, he was probably the last person who survived to see the St. Francis Dam intact. The St. Francis Dam collapsed on March 12, 1928 at 11:57 and 30 seconds p.m. According to research by Dr. J. David Rogers, the catastrophic event began with a landslide of the water-saturated eastern abutment. It was exacerbated by hydraulic uplift with the eventual failure of the dam's western abutment. Personnel at both receiving stations in Los Angeles and at Powerhouse Number 1 noted a sharp drop in voltage on their lines at exactly 11:57 and 30 p.m. This thus establishing the exact time of the dam failure. Damkeeper Tony Harnischweger and his family were the first casualties caught in the flood wave. The body of his girlfriend Leona Johnson was found wedged between 2 blocks of concrete near the base of the dam. Of note, the lady in this photo is not Leona Johnson, but that's Tony's estranged wife. At the time of the dam failure, his wife lived with her parents and their daughter in Cantil, California. Tony, Coder, and Leona lived in a little cabin just below the dam. Neither Tony Harnischweger's body nor that of his 6-year-old son Coder has ever been recovered. 5 minutes after the collapse, a 120-foot-high flood wave destroyed the heavy concrete Powerhouse Number 2, leaving only 2 turbines, and claimed the lives of 64 of the 67 workers and their family members who lived nearby. On March 13th, between 12:05 a.m. and 1 a.m., the floodwaters ravaged San Francisquito Canyon. At the base of the canyon, the water destroyed part of actor Harry Carey's ranch, including a Navajo trading post, which had been a popular tourist attraction. 2 Navajo caretakers lost their lives at the ranch. Carey, luckily, was away on business in New York at the time. The group of Navajos working for the Carey Ranch supposedly called Carey the night before the dam break, asking to leave the ranch for Arizona based on a medicine man's premonition of an impending dam rupture. But Harry Carey Jr. later recalled the Navajos asking Carey 1 month before the disaster if they could leave, as their medicine man had noticed a big crack in the dam while deer hunting. Neither of these stories were true. It actually turned out that the Navajos had left the ranch as part of a regularly scheduled rotation with others of their tribe in Arizona. At 1 a.m., the flood, now 55 feet high, continued generally following the westward course of the Santa Clarita River. It hit and demolished Edison's Saugus substation, leaving the entire Santa Clarita River Valley and parts of Ventura and Oxnard without power. If you pass today on Magic Mountain Parkway, you can actually see the modern substation that's still there. Raymond Starbird, an assistant Edison patrolman at the Saugus substation, was nearly washed away by the flood. He hitched a ride to Wood's Garage next to the Saugus Cafe. There, Starbird called Sheriff Substation Number 6 in Newhall, the current Canyon Theater Guild building, and he's thought to have been the first person to notify the authorities about the flood. At 1:25 a.m., 84 Edison linemen perished at Kemp, a temporary work camp just east of the Los Angeles-Ventura County line. And we will be giving more details about this particular tragedy later in the talks. At 1:30 a.m., telephone operators like Louise Geip in Santa Paula, nicknamed the Hello Girls, bravely stayed at their posts after being notified of the oncoming flood and began calling residents in low-lying areas, urging them to flee to higher ground. Louise Geidt notified California Highway Patrol Officer Thornton Edwards, who lived in Santa Paula, and then started calling the homes of those in danger. The picture on the right, you can see that Thornton Edwards was actually a B movie actor both before and after he was a patrolman in Santa Paula there. Edwards and fellow officer Stanley Baker rode their motorcycles through Santa Paula with sirens blaring to awaken and warn residents of the upcoming flood. Edwards and Baker rode for more than an hour through the lower sections of Santa Paula. They saved many residents who rushed to the hills only to see their homes crushed below them. And Edwards is remembered for his wild yet courageous ride as the Paul Revere of the St. Francis flood. The city of Santa Paula later awarded him this medal. In 2003, a statue was erected in Santa Paula in Edwards and Baker's honor. Around 2 a.m., the phone rang at the Mulholland residence. The chief's daughter answered and woke her father with the terrible news. As he lurched for the phone, it is said that he repeated this mantra over and over. Please God, don't let people be killed. At 5:30 a.m., having devastated much of Santa Paula and heavily damaging the towns of Piru, Fillmore, and Bardesdale, the floodwaters emptied into the Pacific Ocean near Ventura at Montalvo, washing victims and debris out to sea. It took 5 hours and 27 minutes to travel 54 miles from the dam site to the ocean. Immediately following the dam break, 8 agencies, city, county, state, and federal, began investigating the causes of the disaster. Most significant was the 2-week coroner's inquest led by Los Angeles District Attorney Asa Keys. Keys and the coroner's jury relentlessly questioned Mulholland about various problems with the dam's construction. Keys accused Mulholland of ignoring repeated leaks in the dam days before the failure. Asked by Keys if he would build the dam on the same spot again, Mulholland replied, "No, I must be frank and say that now I would not." Keys pressed on, asking Mulholland, "Why not?" His reply, "It failed, that's why. There's a hoodoo on it. It is vulnerable against human aggression and I would not build it there." Mulholland suspected that the dam had been dynamited by an Owens Valley conspiracy ring to avenge its construction, but that was never proven to be the case. Toward the end of his testimony, Mulholland humbly stated, "Don't blame anybody else. You just fasten it on me. If there's an error of human judgment, I am the human." And what politician today would say anything like that?
Yeah.
At the end of the inquest, the coroner's jury concluded the destruction of this dam was caused by the failure of the rock formations upon which it was built, and not by any error in the design of the dam itself or defect in the materials on which the dam was constructed. That conclusion, of course, was wrong. Jurors felt that the preponderance of evidence favored an initial failure on the dam's western abutment, anchored to a rock called red Sespe conglomerate. This theory was later proven incorrect by J. David Rogers' research, which pointed to the Polona schist at the eastern abutment as the initial failure. During the inquest, Keys demonstrated how the Sespe conglomerate rock disintegrates when exposed to water. He actually put rock in a glass of water and let the jurors see it dissolve. Jurors placed the blame squarely on the shoulders of Mulholland and his Bureau of Waterworks and Supply. They further attacked the unquestioning trust in Mulholland's expertise. The final jury statement made national headlines, stating, "The construction of a municipal dam should never be left to the sole judgment of one man, no matter how eminent." In March 1929, Mulholland took full responsibility for the worst U.S. civil engineering failure of the 20th century and resigned from his office. During the coroner's inquest, he had said, "The only people I envy in this whole thing are the dead." On August 14, 1929, the Department of Public Works was authorized to review all non-federal dams over 25 feet high or which would hold more than 50 acre-feet of water. The new legislation allowed the state to employ consultants as necessary and gave it full authority to supervise the maintenance and operation of non-federal dams, a legacy from the St. Francis Dam disaster, which to this day supposedly makes dams safer, although dams actually are not doing so well these days either. Fred Eaton died on March 11th, 1934, ironically, one day before the 6th anniversary of the dam failure. Ultimately, Eaton's desire to enrich himself by selling his property in Long Valley to Los Angeles for an exorbitant price to build a dam and reservoir drove a wedge between him and Mulholland. The two men never talked again until shortly before Eaton's death. The deadlock ultimately destroyed both men. A dam was eventually built at Long Valley in 1941, creating what is now called Crowley Lake in the Owens Valley. 4 months after Eaton's death, William Mulholland died in his home on July 22, 1935. He was a broken man. And now I'm going to turn over the talk to Ann Stansel.
So my presentation today is going to focus on recovery and restoration efforts in the wake of the disaster, focusing on care of the survivors, disposal of the dead, and the claims payouts. Also share how the disaster and dead have been commemorated through the community monuments and memorials and individual grave markers. On the night of the disaster, approximately 10,000 individuals were living in the path of the flood. At least 2,500 buildings were partially or totally destroyed, and 8,000 acres of farmland were inundated and ruined by erosion. The floodwaters took 5.5 hours, and they caused a 54-mile path of destruction. The waters carried buildings and trees and fences and telegraph and power poles, railway tracks, livestock, and bodies. Pilots hired by Ventura County were dispatched at sunrise to report the extent of the damage and photograph the expanse of the flood zone in preparation for expected litigation against the city of Los Angeles. The first priority was sheltering those left homeless and recovering the dead. All available police, sheriffs, water department personnel, and charitable service organizations were mobilized immediately. In the early morning hours following the disaster, first aid stations, canteens, clothing deposits, and temporary housing were established by the Red Cross at Saugus, Newhall, Fillmore, and Santa Paula. Police were stationed throughout the flood zone to keep looters and sightseers at bay. Rescue teams searched for survivors who remained stranded. Several were found in Santa Paula, though further up the zone, it was quickly realized that there were very few survivors. Efforts were focused on the systematic identification of bodies. The recovering of bodies was aided by use of tractor and steam shovel. The Fish and Game Commission searched far out to sea, and the American Legion of Ventura requisitioned 8 small boats which were used to patrol up and down the coast. Only one body was found in the ocean, although many others were found on the snags near the mouth of the river or later floated back to the beaches of Oxnard and Hueneme, directly south of the Santa Clara River outlet. Makeshift morgues were established at multiple locations. Lists of identified victims and descriptions of unidentified were published daily in local papers. Coroner Frank Nance oversaw the handling of bodies in Los Angeles County, and Coroner Oliver Reardon coordinated efforts in Ventura County. Reardon personally prepared many of the victims for interment and made burial arrangements for both identified and unidentified individuals lacking surviving relatives to care for such matters. Bodies were hosed down with hot water so they could be cleaned of mud and repositioned. They were then hosed with cold water and embalmed to extend preservation and held as long as possible for identification. Each victim was photographed. At the Newhall Temporary Morgue, victims were laid out on narrow pine planks and placed at an angle against benches for viewing. Survivors traveled from morgue to morgue within and beyond the flood zone to identify family and neighbors. Mass burial services took place at Reese Cemetery in San Francisquito Canyon, which we'll point out on the way up to the dam site, and as well as at the city cemeteries in Piru, Bardsdale, and Santa Paula within a week of the disaster. More than 3,000 are said to have attended the mass funeral held on March 19th at the city cemetery in Santa Paula. In the disaster's aftermath, the city of Los Angeles quickly announced that it would take financial responsibility for restorations efforts. A citizens restoration committee was formed to oversee the handling of claims. Offices were opened throughout the expanse of the flood-affected area to expedite the process. Identity, kinship, dependency, earning capacity, surviving family and children, and other like information necessary to determine proper consideration of each claim was compiled by both Red Cross agents and the City of Los Angeles agents. Restoration and reconstruction efforts were simultaneous with relief efforts. Los Angeles Mayor Cryer issued a statement acknowledging the city's potential responsibility for damage to property, stating Los Angeles cannot restore the lives lost, but the property damages should be paid. Although Mayor Cryer initially planned to determine fully where legal responsibility lay before initiating the claims process, Mulholland's Deputy Van Norman told the city that no question of legal status of claims should ever be raised, and the moral obligation to repay damage in the valley is sufficient. While conscience might have played a part in this decision, there was also concern that a legal battle would jeopardize the city's position in other important matters such as the Boulder Canyon, which is the Hoover Dam project. The numerous boxes of claim files in the holdings of the LADWP Record Center are a testament to the bureaucratic nature of this disaster. Funded by the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Cal State Northridge, back in 2012, I was able to digitize and index a total of 817 death and personal property claims files and more than 5,000 pages of documents and photographs related to the disaster. And I did this in support of my master's thesis research. The files held a wealth of information, including leads on burial locations of the recovered victims, details concerning individuals reported missing but not recovered, and insight into the claims process and resulting assignment of monetary value to human life in 1930 Los Angeles. This body of information provides a unique opportunity to examine both social and economic conditions reflected by both administration and adjudication of claims. Payouts were comparable across ethnic groups. Few sought legal representation to ensure equality in the determination of settlement amounts, while most other did not retain counsel. One claim on a Japanese American was not paid out because the claims agents cited the California Alien Land Law of 1913. While some claims payouts were so low that they did little more than cover the cost of funeral expenses, about $400 per burial, the settlement amounts did not deter the placement of a grave marker. In other cases, markers are absent when claims payouts would more than comfortably have covered the cost of placing a memorial. The complexity of the claims data provokes interest in a broader aspect of the disaster, the erasure of the St. Francis Dam and its victims from social memory. There are very few monuments and memorials associated with the disaster visible within the communities today. Based on this understanding, I undertook my project expecting to explore circumstances which led to the event being left unmemorialized and excluded from public memory. But very quickly, I realized that there are lots of memorials hiding in plain sight, and there's many diverse forms of commemoration. I focused specifically on grave markers. I found that less than half of the recovered victims are buried in cemeteries within communities of the flood zone. Expanding my survey to the greater LA area revealed over 100 additional interments. Accounting for every one of the recovered victims ultimately required me to expand search to Northern California and across the country. Given that it was unfeasible for me to visit each location in person, I turned to the online resources Ancestry.com and Findagrave.com and was aided by volunteers who ultimately helped me document the burial locations of additional 41 victims dispersed through 19 states. In total, this research has revealed the burial locations of the 308 recovered victims. These individuals are interred in 65 cemeteries across the United States. This is a unique feature of the St. Francis Dam disaster, and it sets it apart from comparative cases I studied in my thesis, including the Mill River flood of 1874, the more well-known Johnstown flood of 1889, and the Buffalo Creek flood of 1972. In each of these comparative cases, research reveals flood casualties are buried in just one or a few cemeteries within their respective flood zones, I should say. As the burial results and casualty demographics clearly demonstrate, the economic circumstances of 1928 had men on the move in search of work, often far removed from their family and hometown. Southern Pacific Railroad transported bodies home free of charge, and the city of LA paid $150 towards the cost of each burial. These circumstances resulted in many flood victims being returned home for burial in a family or community cemetery once they were recovered and identified. The presence of many men from out of state working in the communities of the flood zone most certainly impacted the process of identifying casualties and may account for a number of the individuals who were recovered but not identified. 68 unidentified victims of the disaster are buried in 2 cemeteries in the flood zone. They're all in unmarked graves. 48 unknown victims are buried along the west wall of Ivy Lawn Cemetery in Ventura, just one section over from Coroner Reardon and his family plot. Another 19 unknown dead are interred at Santa Paula Cemetery. In 2004, the Historical Society in town placed a commemorative marker at the spot so that folks actually understood those weren't just available plots in the cemetery, but actually unmarked graves. There is one flood victim that's unidentified that wasn't buried in one of these 2 cemeteries, and that's because he was Japanese and not allowed to be buried there at the time, and so he was buried at Evergreen Cemetery, and he's also in an unmarked grave. So 43% of the graves of flood victims were memorialized with a grave marker, 30% have been left unmarked, 17 involve unidentified individuals, while 54 of the individuals that lie in unmarked graves are unknown, but the grave is unmarked. 7% of the grave markers were placed to serve as a cenotaph, where this is a memorial without a corresponding burial. 2% of the victims were cremated, because that was just something that was coming into trend at that time. Although a concerted effort was made to search for victims, burning of huge piles of debris on irreclaimable land during restoration efforts likely served as funeral pyres for some, and it's probable that their remains will never be recovered. Numerous individuals were reported missing following the failure. Although a few victims have been unearthed over the years, 103 remain unaccounted for today. However, at least some of the missing are likely those that were buried without being identified, and thus the number of casualties cannot be specified as an exact number, but instead of range between 343 and 411. At this time, the state of California officially recognized the failure through this one memorial. You'll see it today. It's at LA DWP Power Plant 2, along with this DWP memorial. Further down the flood zone, we're not visiting today, but a good opportunity to get out there and see the full flood zone. This is in Santa Paula. So most of the memorialization I found while I was surveying these different towns was all community created. Each memorial found illustrated unique aspects of the disaster wished to be remembered and commemorated by the community that put it up. In Santa Paula, for example, is the warning sculpture that Alan mentioned, a monument that honors 2 motorcycle policemen who warned residents of the torrent of water. As Santa Paula is 45 miles downstream from the dam, the community received warning in time for many lives to be saved. In other areas closer to the dam site where there was no more warning, memorials have been placed to honor the dead, such as the community memorial at Reese Cemetery in San Francisquito Canyon. The memorial to flood victims was placed in 1928 by silent film star William Hart and the Newhall Cowboys. Archival resources indicate numerous memorials were placed following the disaster, although few are observable throughout the community today. Many of these live in historical societies, such as ours at the Santa Clarita Valley History Center. These past monuments were most commonly erected by community organizations. Commemorative activities on the 50th and 75th and 90th anniversaries of the disaster resulted in the placing of several memorials. Many of those are still around today. Overall, I found that many memorials are not successfully maintained over time, and that's because the primary group of individuals that supported it have passed. It's the same concept of why cemeteries go abandoned, because the people that visit there over time pass as well. The cemetery will go abandoned. The 54-mile flood zone is a large expanse of small heterogeneous communities. This presents a significant challenge for each to effectively placing just one memorial that represents how everybody remembered the event. Several attempts at large-scale memorialization, including the St. Francis Dam National Memorial Highway and the Moments in Time project, have been met with resistance or just not embraced by multiple communities to make them successful. Most of the public narrative that is observable today is through the efforts of a network of historical societies and dam historians, some of whom have come to be known as dammies. The local historical societies throughout the flood zone acknowledge the failure on the anniversary date through activities such as the talk and tour we're doing today. Some enthusiasts like Peggy Kelly with the Santa Paula Times and Leon Warden, owner of SCV TV and host of the Facebook group Santa Clarita Valley History Buffs, are involved with local media and generate articles and interest around the anniversary dates. Most of the dammies, or historians, because everybody doesn't embrace that term, have communicated firsthand with survivors and descendants, influencing their understanding and remembering of the disaster, as well as what they choose to share with the public today. Diane's going to share with you some really amazing firsthand stories. An important component of my ongoing research, because this ended up being way more than my thesis topic, and 10, 12 years later, I'm still actively involved in trying to identify unidentified victims and share about the history. So I have a Facebook group called St. Francis Dam Archaeology, and this was based on my thesis project, which was the Forgotten Casualties Project. So it allowed me to engage both with students and other stakeholders to better understand the impact of the disaster on the lives and people of the flood path and its significance within the social history of Southern California. As part of the project, my graduate advisor and I created this Facebook group, and it serves as a virtual memorial where descendants, dammies, and other stakeholders communicate, creating an online space for the sharing of information and remembering of the disaster to continue. Thank you. I look forward to speaking to each of you on the tour.
My involvement with the St. Francis Dam started long before I was even born. My grandfather, who called himself the greatest fisherman in the world, he wanted to fish in the reservoir behind the dam. But the problem was that Tony Harnishfigger, the dam keeper, would only allow his friends to accompany him in his boat. So my grandfather wanted to go out there and make friends with Tony Harnishfigger. So he dragged my grandmother, my mother, and her two siblings out to the dam site. And my grandfather followed Tony around all day long, you know, bugging him and bugging him and bugging him. And finally, Tony said, you know, okay, I will take you out next week and we can go fishing. And my grandfather was very excited. But little did they know that 2 days later, the dam would fail, Tony would be dead, and the dam would be history.
Let me just show her.
you. So hard to be able to see it. It's not going. Okay, there we go. So Haviland, which you can still see today, if you know where Il Trocadero is, if you go out the side door and like cross the street, there's a beige building there. That's where Haviland was. So Haviland was a happy place. This is where residents of Newhall would go to, kick back a couple of beers and, after a hard, long work week, they would go there to dance and have a really good time. But on March 13th, 1928, Haviland became the morgue in Newhall. And by the way, no business has been successful there since. Okay. So on the morning of March 13th, ambulances frequented the establishment, bringing bodies from San Francisquito Canyon. Here you can see a coffin being delivered to Haviland. Most of the bodies were wrapped. I gotta be able to see this. Okay, most of the bodies were merely wrapped in white sheets and transported to the makeshift morgue for identification. Bodies were crowded onto tables and held for viewing at Haviland. Haviland would no longer be a happy place. This is Lillian and Lyman Curtis. They were married in Bakersfield on August 16, 1921. They came down to Los Angeles, where Lyman found employment with the Bureau of Waterworks and Supply. They were housed at the Employee Village at Powerhouse 2. Lillian said later that living out there in the country was a dream. They were so very happy. The couple had 3 children, Margie, Maisie, and little Danny. They had seen leaks in the dam the day before, and they were concerned that the dam was going to break. But they were reassured by Mulholland the day before that the dam was safe. Later that night, Lyman awoke, and he felt a mist in the air. He ran to his front door and he saw a wall of water coming towards him. Quickly he woke up Lillian and threw her out the back window, basically. And little Danny was still in a bassinet in their bedroom. So he handed Danny out to her and said, run up the hill as fast as you can. And she started up the hill. He went back for the 2 girls. Here are the children, Margie, Maisie, and little Danny. Lyman was too late. Margie, Maisie, and their father died that night. Lillian and Danny, I think I skipped one. Lillian and Danny were inundated with water almost immediately. She stopped. She was waiting to hear from Lyman to see if the girls and Lyman were behind her. She dropped Danny. Danny held onto a little bush, and he said, Mommy, Mommy, please don't let the water take us. In this photo, this is a recent photo of Powerhouse 2. You can locate the penstocks and the powerhouse in this photo. Directly below the powerhouse, you can see the road and then a cement catch basin. And immediately below that, you can see a hill. This is the hill where Lillian and Danny spent the night. Their little spotted dog followed them up there. She dug a hole with her bare hands on top of that hill. and she put Danny in the hole. Then she took the spotted dog and put the spotted dog on top of Danny, and this is how she kept Danny warm for the remainder of the night. The girls were buried together. Here's their headstone. In 1978, a reunion dinner was held for the survivors of the St. Francis Dam. This photo was taken of Danny and Lillian at that dinner. Danny was recalling the moment that he was coaxing his mother up to the hill. "Mommy, Mommy, please, please don't let the water take us," he said. This is Ray Rising. Ray Rising was one of the neighbors of the Curtis family. He was raised in Minnesota. His favorite pastime was swimming. He loved to swim in all the beautiful lakes near his house. Ray worked at Powerhouse 1 and Powerhouse 2, but on the 12th, he was off duty. He was sound asleep in his house with his wife and his 3 daughters. He had no clue that the dam had broken until the house was swept off of the foundation. Instinctively, he started to swim. He was inundated with 120 to 140 feet of water. He was first thrown into a tree. Then he got tangled up in the power lines that came from the powerhouse. He struggled and he struggled and he struggled. And amazingly, finally, he broke free. He was able to surface. A roof from one of the houses in the village passed by. He was able to hoist himself up onto that roof. He was surfed it down the river for a little ways, and he was finally able to jump onto dry land. And he made his way back up to the hill where Lillian, Danny, and the spotted dog sat. Ray hoped to find his family, but it was not to be. Julia and his 3 daughters were all drowned. Ray was devastated. He lost nearly everything. The little village where Ray grew up heard about the flood, and they wanted to help him out. They took up a collection of household goods, money, and food, but they didn't know how they were going to get all of this to California. Luckily, a lady from the village next door was bringing her brother out to Long Beach because he had just gotten a job as a longshoreman. She agreed to take all of this and to find Ray. Her name was Ruby Loretta Raymond. Ruby and Ray fell in love. They traveled the world and visited many exotic places, but after 15 years on the road, they headed back to California. Ray got a job with LADWP. He was stationed at Powerhouse number 3, which is currently called the Los Angeles Reservoir. It's at the terminus of the Cascades. And then, surprise, a beautiful little girl was born, and they named her Carol. Carol was really unhappy living at Powerhouse 3 because all of the workers were older, and there were no children for her to play with. Carol bugged her dad and bugged him and bugged him and bugged him. She finally wore him down, and he agreed to move back to Powerhouse 2, where he had lost his first family. Carol was happy because there were children to play with, but imagine the nightmares that Ray had. Carl Matthews was the most popular of all of the LADWP Bureau of Waterworks and Supply because his hobby was making furniture, and all of his friends wanted them to make them a table or a chair or a side table. On the night of March 12th, just before midnight, he finished up work at Powerhouse 2. He descended into the basement to put a final layer of varnish on the chair he had made that he was planning to deliver the next day. A few minutes later, water from the dam decimated the powerhouse and crushed it, filling the basement with mud, water, and debris. The next day, rescuers frantically dug in the basement looking for Carl, but it was not to be. His body was later recovered, but the chair was never found. The Cesena family lived in Newhall on Pine Street. Leonardo and his wife had 12 children. Leonardo worked for Newhall Land and Farm and was the wrangler in San Francisquito Canyon. He died unexpectedly 1 month before the dam failure. This left the family without an income. His son Philip, pictured here on top of the mule, although he was not the eldest, he withdrew from the Newhall School District and registered at the San Francisquito School. He moved in with his cousins on the Ruiz property below the dam. He wanted to learn his father's trade and support his mom and his brothers and sisters. He started by mucking out stalls and grooming the animals. Then he met the Navajo Native Americans who lived in the canyon and taught the B-roll actors stunts on the horses, and they used it in the movies. In fact, you can still see these stunts in the old talkies, the first talkies, and the old silent films. The Navajos taught Philip how to stand comfortably atop a mule. This was his happy place. When the flood hit the Ruiz property, Philip was killed. Here's the trading post that housed the Navajo Native Americans and the bee actors. You can still see these feats in the silent films. I suggest that you look some of them up because some of them are just fantastic. On March 13th, 1928, a search party was launched from Powerhouse 1, which was above the dam, to look for survivors and those who may have perished. Otto Steen, pictured here, was the leader of this party. In 1978, at the reunion dinner, he was asked how he found Lillian Curtis, Ray Rising, Danny Curtis, and the spotted dog up on top of the hill. He said, "Ugh, there was this woman, and she was screaming and screaming and screaming." Obviously, it was easy to find her. The rescue party took the survivors down the road to a first aid station where they were transported to get the help they so badly needed. In this photo, you can see graves being dug and mourners at the Ruiz Cemetery following the flood. Today, the cemetery looks much different. The old wooden grave markers have either disintegrated or burned, and many of the small crosses and the little angels have been vandalized. Here are the tombstones of the Ruiz family, all of whom died in the flood. Here's a close-up of those markers. Notice the date, March 13th, 1928. And Philip Cesena, the kid atop the mule, is also buried here next to his father. As we move farther down the floodplain and out of San Francisquito Canyon, we come to Casting Junction. Emma Traxler and her youngest child, Johnny Traxler, left Modesto on March 12th to visit relatives in Chatsworth. By the time Emma reached Casting Junction, she was absolutely exhausted. She stopped for gas. The owner of the gas station had a small cottage for rent, so Emma decided to stop for the night and continue on to Chatsworth the next day. The next day, little Johnny was found in the debris of the collapsed cabin, but no one else was found nearby. Emma's relatives called her husband to tell him that Emma had not arrived, but he didn't come down to help to try to find them. Eventually, Emma's brother traveled down from Oakland to help. He found Emma in the makeshift morgue in Santa Paula. He checked every other morgue along the floodplain, and he finally found Johnny, little Johnny, in Happyland in Newhall. Actor William S. Hart had been visiting the young boy at Happyland and was saddened that no one had claimed him. Hart bought him the little casket that you see here. He also bought him a cowboy outfit, a little pointed hat like the one that Hart liked to wear, and a toy pistol. Because he had been unclaimed for so long, Hart had arranged for a burial at the Ruiz Cemetery. Just before the planned burial, Emma was found and the two were reunited at Happyland. Emma's husband would not pay for the burials. Our local Newhall sheriff at the time paid for Emma's casket, and the owner of the cemetery in Chatsworth gave up his and his wife's plots so that Emma and little Johnny could be buried together there. You see the little memorial right by Hart. That memorial can still be seen at the Ruiz Cemetery, and that was purchased by Hart for little Johnny. This is the San Francisquito school that Philip Cesena transferred to when he left the Newhall School District. The entire school and all but one of the students were killed in the flood. Their teacher, Cecilia Small, was so very popular with the students because she knew all of their birthdays and she threw parties for each and every one of them. The Los Angeles Times reported that three school districts were virtually destroyed. The San Francisquito school was gone, the B school was gone, and neither school ever recovered. The Saga school lost 8 children, but the district still survives today. At 1:25 a.m. on March 13th, 150 Edison linemen were fast asleep in their tents at Kemp Camp. This was a temporary work site just east of the Los Angeles and Ventura County line on Highway 126. They had been installing new electrical lines and towers along the highway. A noise like a freight train attracted the attention of night watchman Ed Locke. He saw a wall of water mixed with debris moving towards the workers' tents. He watched in horror as the massive flood approached the camp. Locke frantically ran through the camp, waking as many men as possible, trying to get them out of harm's way. Some of the men that he woke up thought it was a joke, and they didn't get out of their tents. After all, it wasn't raining. Those who got out of their tents were able to run or swim for their lives. Ed Locke later was hailed as a hero. He continued to try to save more and more lives until he himself was caught up in the flood and died. The water hit the geological outcropping called Blue Cut and doubled back on the camp, creating a whirlpool that uprooted the tents. The tents that were fastened up popped up onto the whirlpool. Those tents with open doors were flooded, and the men in those tents were at the mercy of the raging water. 84 people died. I spoke to the daughter of one of the men who survived the flood at Kemp Camp. His name was Elliot Gould. Imagine the noise of the debris and the water churning over and over as it approached the camp. Imagine the human remains being beaten by all the debris in that water. Elliot Gould was asleep in his tent when the water and debris hit. It was so powerful that it picked up his tent and threw it up into the air. Elliot was one of 4 men in the tent. He was the one closest to the door. The force of the water threw him up into the air, and then the tent wrapped around the other 3 men. They quickly perished. Elliot was beaten by the debris and suffered many broken bones. He had but one arm to keep him afloat. The pain was incredible. The flood hit that rock formation that I mentioned called Blue Cut and caused a whirlpool of water, debris, the dead and dying. As Elliot swirled around in the whirlpool, he passed close by Highway 126. A Spanish-speaking couple managed to grab him and drag him up onto the road. Elliot sat there in horrendous pain. He was shivering from the cold. He didn't remember how much time had passed when he thought about it later. He turned around to thank the Spanish-speaking couple, but they were gone. Every day, for the rest of his life, he prayed to God to forgive him for not thanking the couple that he referred to as his angels. These are the vehicles that were salvaged at Kemp Camp. And although the cars were battered and all the glass was broken, I found it very interesting that not a single tire was flat. Immediately after the Kemp Camp site was the home of Joe Gottardi. He was a supervisor from U-Haul Land and Farm. His house was on their land. He was in charge of the orange orchards, and he grew lima beans for extra money himself. The Gottardi family was very religious. On the night of the flood, Joe woke up due to all the screaming and the noise and all the debris in the water. He too said it sounded like a freight train. He looked out the back door and quickly gathered his family around him. He told them they didn't have time to run, but they should get down on their knees and pray. Soon the water hit and blew the house off the foundation. None of them could swim. One daughter, Alvina, managed to surface. 2 weeks before the flood, Alvina was having a recurring dream. In the dream, a Catholic nun came to her and told her over and over, "Grab onto a branch. Grab onto a branch." Despite the fact that she was choking on fouled water, she managed to surface, and she saw a branch in front of her. She grabbed onto it, and then she saw her father struggling in the water, and she moved the branch over to him, but he put his hands up in the air, and he didn't take the branch. But the branch grabbed onto his nightshirt, and he and Alvina floated down the river until they ran aground in Santa Paula. This is Joe and his bride, Frances, on their wedding day. They had 6 children, 6 girls and 6 boys. Here are the sons. All 3 sons died in the flood. Here you have Richard, Reno, and little Joe. This is 15-year-old Alvina on Easter Sunday. Unfortunately, we don't have pictures of the other 2 girls. This is the girl with the branch. Joe Gottardi dug tirelessly and was found 6 days later, still digging and looking for his family. He found his wife and 4 of his children. The youngest daughter, Lenore, was never recovered. Here are the headstones of the family in Piru Cemetery. Lenore's plot, the baby, supports a cenotaph. In speaking with the children of survivors, The main thing that everyone mentioned was that this event was just something that happened. No one blamed anybody for the failure. Currently, all of our dams in California are poorly rated. In fact, 2 are rated F. Many are rated D. I see this tragedy of the St. Francis as the caged canary in the mine. It's a warning that we need to heed so that history can never repeat itself. Thank you.
Was an earthquake. The lights went out in the cabin, but it didn't stop shaking. It continued on. So BH, I don't know his name, I assume it's Edward, got dressed and ran down to that ridge right above us, right where the pin stocks go down the hill. At that point, the flood had dropped 20 feet. It had gone through so fast. All he could see was the dark water of just the 2 pen stocks that existed at the time, going down into the water, and there was a green glow of the turbine still going. Everything else was gone. All the cottages, the meeting hall, the school, everything was gone. At that same time, Lillian and Daniel Curtis were scampering up that hill behind us. Ray Rising was swimming and struggling for his life all at the same time. At that point right around the turn here is probably where he was able to grab onto a roof of a shed that crashed into the hillside, and he was able to get up the hill and up to the fire line. All of that happened so fast. The water went through and went down. Lives were lost, all in just a matter of a minute or 2. You look at the structure, Powerhouse 2, that was rebuilt right on the footprint of the original powerhouse. I'm not sure, it was maybe about 15 to 20 years later they put in the 3rd pin stock. And instead of rivets they use welds. You can see the difference in the pipe. But imagine, if you will, a flood wave 60 feet above the structure you see. And that's what it was coming through here.
So what was the height of the water coming through here?
About 120 feet.
And what was the speed of the water?
The speed of the water was gauged at 18 miles an hour coming through the flat, and then through here it probably picked up. It was supposedly 1.3 million cubic feet per second coming out of the dam.
Just for perspective, that building is about 60 feet. So it's twice as high.
So it's a pretty horrific thought, just how the water just came down through here. Are there any other questions?
Just
Yes.
for perspective. So it literally, it breaks, it rushes through. Are we looking at like a 10-second time period of it comes through and...
The time from the dam to here was 5 minutes.
Okay, then it passes here within...
It passes here within an hour. The entire...
It takes everything for about an hour to get
The entire dam drained in just over an hour, about 70 minutes they calculate. And that was a 3-mile lake at 180 feet.
So the water actually came down from here, correct?
Correct.
That direction. So where is this water coming from?
That's from the LA aqueduct.
Oh, okay.
That's where they generate the power.
Gotcha.
St. Francis was solely storage for a year's supply of water to LA.
Okay.
That's
So
why
this
you take
water
that
here
time
was
with it,
eventually
because it's
feeding the
coming from
Cascade and
there.
Silmar?
That's true. It's feeding the Cascades and Silmar.
So this is all flowing down.
This over here is the hill where the lady dug the hole.
Yes.
Put the baby.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Is there any other question before we get back on the bus? Yes, sir.
Yeah, just a thought. Before the dam was built, or when they were thinking about building it, Was it flowing about like it's flowing now? Because you look at it and I say, why would you ever decide to build a dam on this thing? There's not much water coming through there.
I'm pretty sure back 100 years ago the creek was flowing pretty more so, yes. But mainly it was when they were building the aqueduct, Mulholland noticed that the flat plain area where they staged everything out where the reservoir is now made for a perfect dam, and they could divert the water from the aqueduct to create the reserve. Okay, we're gonna get moving.
Okay, if you look off to your left, here is an uplift fault. This is the San Francisquito fault, and on the left you have Kelowna schist, and on the right you have Sespe conglomerate. This is an uplift fault. One of the things that was a potential reason for the dam to fail was this fault. However, it was proven that it never moved, and it hasn't moved since. It's been classified as a dead fault. And of course, it's only a dead fault until it decides to move. But you can see the difference in the two colors right there. And so the Kelowna schist